Welcome to the podcast for emerging and blue-collar leaders. This is The Growth Project. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to The Growth Project. Thanks for tuning in again. It's been a little longer gap than I anticipated. Originally, it's been about 3 weeks since our last episode, and I did commit to bi-weekly early in the piece, so thanks for bearing with me. Today, I'm really excited to have this chat with you all. I think it's a topic that's very, very important to be had, and I think in the industries that I work in, I think this is a topic that needs a bit more attention, and some of the conversations I've been having with people very much supportive of that opinion as well. So today we're talking about why trauma-informed frontline leaders get better results, and what we have to understand is that trauma does have a profound impact on our lives. We all have and will continue to have trauma in our lives in varied forms. And in this episode, we'll be looking at ways in which trauma can affect workplace cultures and our experiences in the workplace, particularly in blue-collar settings where physically dangerous and fast-paced environments are very commonplace. Today, I'm really thrilled to be joined by Nichole Myles, an expert in the field of trauma, resilience, and psychology. Nichole has a master's in industrial organisational psychology and is also certified in trauma and resilience, as well as diversity, equity, and inclusion, and non-profit management. Nichole, I'm really excited to talk with you today to gain a deeper understanding of how trauma can manifest in the workplace and the importance and benefits of creating trauma-informed workplaces. When we first connected about doing this, I checked out your website and I saw your TED Talk and I saw your talk at LEAD 2022, and I was quite taken back by your story. And I really admire the work that you're doing. And even already the insights that you've shared with me made me quickly realise that we needed to record this episode. I had it planned for a little bit later in my plan, but I thought it was really, really important to bring it forward. I feel privileged to have you joining me today. So maybe you could start just by telling the listeners a little bit about yourself, your story, and what it is that you do.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for having me. I agree with you. I think this is such a fundamental conversation that we need to have, and I'm excited to be having it and being able to share it with lots of listeners, especially in that blue collar world. You and I chatted a little bit before we started recording. I'm the granddaughter of farmers, and I grew up in the Midwest in the United States, where we make farm equipment and we work with our hands. We get dirty and do things at the end of our day, and yet trauma is part of our everyday lives as well, because trauma is really part of the human experience. And if you're feeling uncomfortable, listeners, and squishy about that word, buckle up, because we're going to say it a lot. But it's going to be okay, because I actually believe that trauma leads to great transformation. And my personal story has a lot to do with that. I did find myself, as far too many of us do, inside an intimate partner relationship, in my case, a marriage, to someone who was abusive. And like so many people, I tried to do what I think a lot of us do when those traumas are happening, which is kind of muscle through it, right? No matter what your setting is, I tried to muscle through it. I tried to work with it and see if I could accommodate everything that was happening until, unfortunately, I reached really a pretty dangerous apex. I got very close to losing my life. I had a credible threat issued, and I'm an incredibly fortunate person in that the credible threat was issued by my estranged husband at the time, now my ex-husband, to police, and police actually responded to me. They came and proactively found me and told me about this threat. They were concerned for my safety and moved me into hiding. I was 8 months pregnant with my third child at the time. I was educated and working in my community and a member of my church, and I sort of looked like a whole lot of normal middle-class women with children. Up to that point, I'd been a teacher, and all of a sudden I had to disappear. It was all over. It all upended. And I spent the next about 14 months living in hiding, losing everything effectively, my career, my community, my home, my finances, all of it disappeared through this process. And on the other end of it, I was left with this life I needed to restart and rebuild, and no real path to do so. A lot of times with acute trauma, this happens for a lot of people. No matter what your acute trauma is, there's service for that moment, right? For that thing that happened. And those are really important services, whether that's an emergency service or something like me where I was moved into shelters, or whether you have a workplace accident, right? And there's crews that come in and help deal with that. Medical service, that's all really important. But at the end of that phase of the acute trauma, there's not anything else afterwards. And the dirty little secret about trauma is it's not over just because it's over. And so what happened for me is I spent the next 10 years or so really rebuilding my life and trying to get a grasp on a new identity, on a new career, on kind of a new everything while raising these kids. And I got very curious during COVID-19 especially, about how I had and had not coped with that rebuild. And I started studying trauma and resilience and went back to school again and got involved in organizational psychology because I had in my rebuild become a nonprofit leader. And I was seeing people who were also carrying these stories. And there were two ways to carry them. They were either completely weighing them down and preventing them from doing the things they needed to do to be productive, or they were often propelling them, which happened to be my story. I was suddenly propelled into all of these spaces of making things well and making people well, and looking at the experience I had going from somebody who had quite a lot of privilege, actually, to someone who had been living homeless, and what that was like, and what it was like to raise children in this middle class and upper middle class life, and what it was like to raise children when you needed government support. And suddenly I was propelled by all of those things. And I thought that for me ended up making all the difference. I was able to rebuild my life because I was propelled by that. And it turned out there's actually a psychological theory about that. It's called post-traumatic growth. And that's really what I started to study. And that's what I'm doing now, is going from place to place and talking to wonderful people like you and saying, it's not so much the trauma, it's what you do with it afterwards. And accepting that we're going to have those traumas in our lives, but that we will know how to manage them, and not just manage them away, but actually leverage them to create momentum in our personal lives and our professional lives. This is really actually possible to do, and I want people to know how to do it.
What a powerful message, and so important. And one of the things that came to mind when you were giving us that your experience was that a lot of people tend to think, don't they, that the traumatic events in our lives are just the big things, but you also spoke about the things that happened and all the tentacles that had into other parts of your life. And I guess the trauma isn't just a big event, and the abuses and that credible threat experience that you had is the obvious big trauma item, but there were all the other things. You had to uproot your life, go into hiding. That causes trauma also, the things that are attached to that, don't they? It's not just the big event.
Right. I call those things, there are capital T traumas, right? And then there are little t traumas. There are lowercase t traumas. And we have those lowercase t traumas kind of all around us. And that was one of the really interesting things for me coming out of this, why I study the post-traumatic growth part is, some of the little t traumas were things like, I'm in the US, I know you are not, but everything is based on credit rating. And this happened to me, the time frame was during the financial crisis of 2008 and heading into 2009. So credit rating became all there was. And, little t trauma was like going to the bank and realizing that I couldn't open a checking account anymore because I didn't have a good enough credit score. There were these little things that kind of poked at me along the path that wouldn't let go, would remind me of the rest of this stuff. And what I learned studying this was there's the neurobiology, not to be too science geeky, but I am a little science geeky, is inside our brains. Brains are very smart, but not very perceptive. So your brain doesn't know if your particular trauma was a car accident, and that sound, car accidents makes that particular popping sound. If that sound is part of your trauma, there's the real big trauma, the car accident. And then there's every time you hear that sound, what you might commonly call a trigger. Right? You call that a trigger, you have to replay that. Your brain does not actually know the difference between whether or not when it hears that sound, it's an actual car accident or it's just the sound of a car accident. It actually does not know the difference. It responds the exact same way every time. And that's why when we see people carrying trauma into their workplace, why we start to see the kinds of dysfunctions that we see is because brain doesn't know the difference. And listen, trauma response actually isn't a terrible thing. So again, listeners have made them all squirmy because I keep saying the word trauma and I won't stop. But trauma is a protective thing. This helped us. This is why we didn't all get eaten by saber-toothed tigers, because we learned what happened when it chased us. And then we learned about the footprints. You see this saber-toothed tiger footprints means tiger means get out of there. And hearing a story in the next village over about somebody getting attacked by a tiger suddenly meant, okay, time to move out because tiger. This is how we stay alive. So it's not a negative thing, but it can have negative consequences if we don't know how to manage it afterwards. And that's the problem. Brain doesn't know the difference either between whether or not it was a car accident or a saber-toothed tiger. And brain also doesn't know the difference between whether or not it was that or a presentation you were supposed to give on Friday. It really doesn't know the difference. It's all the same.
Yeah, and that's where I really wanted to explore next with you, because what I see, and to give you a little bit of a background in terms of how I've started my journey on going down all these rabbit holes, is during COVID, the pandemic, everything was turned upside down. And like many, many people, my mental health started to take a bit of a turn, and I started suffering some ill effects and noticing some differences in the way I was just existing, I guess, to put it really bluntly. And what I realized for me, some childhood traumas that I experienced, and probably one of the big ticket items would be I sustained a lot of bullying as a child in school, and quite severe bullying at school. And some of these traumas came really bubbling to the surface during the pandemic. So in my efforts to deal with that and seek help, professional help, I started to learn about the traumas. And when I started dealing with them and unpacking them and working to resolve them, I started to see all the other tentacles that were reaching into other parts of my lives and being helped to see that, this kind of explains why I have these reactions in these situations. And so I'm thinking that there are a lot of people that I work with and see and deal with on a regular basis that obviously are aware that they've sustained some trauma in their lives, whether it might be a car accident or a loss in the family or something like that. And there seems to be a perception that there's a grieving period or there's a period of getting over it and dealing with it, and then we move on. And some of these behaviors we see in the workplace when things get difficult or tense are just attitude problems or stress related. But we're starting to learn more, aren't we, that these can often be the responses that you've just spoken about.
Yes. Well, we're such a modern society of people who want to just brush that off and move forward, aren't we? Like we just, get over that, just move on forward. And what you learned, and I think what a lot of us learned during COVID, one of the ways that we've been brushing it off and moving forward, so to speak, was by being inordinately busy and assaulted by all sorts of chaos around us, right? Being able to be with people, being able to go out to bars and pubs, being able to, interact with all of these people. And then suddenly it got very quiet. And when it got very quiet, what we learned is that those things don't actually go away. They just dim a little bit. And if we don't learn how to process those things and understand them, then they will routinely flame up. And right, that's where we see them in the workplace. That's where we see them in our relationships, in our parenting, and all of those places, is because they didn't go away, because we didn't cope with them. We didn't deal with them at the time, and we never had. And so bravo to you, first of all, for recognizing that and for going to therapy. I actually, believe it or not, in my journey coming out of domestic violence, partially because I was raising children and I was engaged in the noise. I was trying to keep myself busy. I didn't seek therapeutic support. I also did it's done. It's over. I need to move on. I have so much to do. I have these children to raise. I have to rebuild this life. I don't have time for this. And it really was also during COVID for me, where I was like, that was a huge mistake. And I'd known for a while that it had been a huge mistake, but that was the time when it had gotten quiet enough where I was like, no, this is really a significant mistake. Also, not for nothing, for everyone who's listening, when you do that, it's not only hard on your psyche, it's hard on your body. It actually takes a toll on your physical body. So you referenced bullying. Bullying would fall into the category of something we call ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences. So we have adult traumas and we have childhood traumas. And the ACEs scale, you can actually measure. It's a 10-point scale. You can look it up and you check the boxes. You'll find that these have absolutely nothing to do, or almost nothing to do, with physical health, with the exception of, I think, food insecurity is on that list. But everything else is something social, societal, bullying, abuses, etc. And what you can find out is that that number actually equals the rate and risk at which you will experience things like heart disease and stroke and diabetes and all of these other kinds of pervasive long-term health issues that we have. And this is a really interesting thing that happens in the workplace too, right? Because we have people who are suffering from these kind of chronic inflammatory diseases or health diseases that limit them. A lot of that actually goes back to trauma, as it would turn out. And so when I work with folks, when I work with organizations and we work with trauma-informed practices, the golden question in trauma-informed practices, we have the golden rule, we also have the golden question in trauma-informed practices, is actually what happened to you instead of what is wrong with you. Because that's what you're alluding to, right? You have all of these behaviors that were finding their way, leaking into these other spaces in your life. And we might simply discount that, especially as leaders, as a difficult employee, as somebody, we all have had this employee, gee, really good at his job when he's good, but boy, when he's off, it's just, I don't know what's wrong with that guy, right? That is a trauma response. Right? Yeah. Nobody actually goes to their job. Very few people go to their job to be difficult, to be the employee that nobody likes, or to be lacking in production. We want to be our best. But if we're carrying these weights forward and we are not existing in environments that are healthy for us and help us deal with those traumas, this is not in any way to say you need to have a therapist in your workplace. You don't. Therapy is great and it's wonderful and people should get it. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about putting in environments and language and skills that are considered soft skills now that will build up folks, help them have those tentacles pull back a little bit in their behavior, and they can be more productive, which at the end of the day is good for your wellness as an employee. And it's good for your business if you're a leader, because now you've got more productive people who are hanging around longer.
Couldn't agree more, Nichole. If I could ask, though, I've got the term in the title as well, and you mentioned it, trauma-informed. For the people listening who might be thinking, trauma, what does that even mean? Can you give us the brief?
Right. Trauma-informed. It's so interesting because this is an entire practice. It goes back to around 2001. There was some studies done 2001, 2003, in spaces that would normally be considered response organizations, high stress organizations, hospitals, mental health providers, emergency services workers, people who are maybe directly having encounters with things that could be acutely traumatizing. And what the research initially did was say, how do we help the people who are providing these services be well themselves? Because we recognize that they're seeing and encountering all of these things. And so this idea of a trauma-informed practice or a trauma-informed organization was born from that space. We are going to take employees and people we know are encountering high amounts of trauma, and we want to build some framework for them to help reduce that, because we know it's having an effect on their well-being, on their productivity, and all of the things. Fast forward, a decade and a half, so 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago now, and people started to go, that whole trauma-informed thing really applies to lots of places, doesn't it? And so now there's this kind of more universal evolution in trauma-informed practices that are starting to take hold, where we can say there are pillars of wellness inside of our workplaces. Collaboration, communication, peer support, safety, recognition of all of our differences and uniquenesses and experiences. These spaces that really we know healthy workplaces have in them are considered trauma-informed, which basically means we are trying to do things to maximize the potential and honor the experience of our employees without re-traumatizing them.
Yes. Okay. Thank you for clarifying. That's really helpful. You triggered a thought, and I had a note here to come to at some point, and you hit on something that reminded me of this. When I was preparing for this episode, I was looking around at some studies and whatnot, and not particularly about trauma, but I can see a direct link here. I'm interested in your thoughts. There was a study in 2012 which was examining the impact of abusive supervision on employees, and it found that leaders who are promoted for reasons other than leadership qualities are more likely to engage in abusive behaviours or display abusive behaviours in the workplace. So I've got two questions for you about this. Firstly, do you think, being 2012, a decade later, do you think that this is still relevant? And secondly, in a domestic setting, you explained or you touched on your experience with domestic violence. We know that offenders implement structure to facilitate their abuses, right? And things like financial control, monitoring activities and whereabouts, and all of those sorts of things. And how might these paralleled structures look in a workplace setting?
That's a great question. So first of all, 2012, still a really valid study. And I will give you the legitimate history and unapologetically my opinion, because I have studied organizational psychology. This is where my master's degree is. The study of organizational psychology is less than 200 years old total. If you compare that to things like, human behavioral psychology, we've literally been doing almost since the beginning of time, since we could carve into tablets, we've more or less been pondering our existence as humans. But as humans in a workplace, this really has generated only in the last 200 years. And so it's a very, very new area of psychology, and it's generated from workplaces, largely Western-based workplaces, which meant that they were white male-centered as a general rule, and that the workers that worked for them often were either not of the same class of white male or were not white male. And that's really important. So, for example, in the US, Um, children under 16, between the ages of 6 and 16, made up nearly 40% of the workforce in the 1800s.
Wow.
Impoverished women who had been either widowed or never married, etc., had been prostitutes perhaps, made up about 10% of that workforce. And we don't really know the percentage of people who were indigenous or African American freed slaves because we didn't even bother to count them because we didn't count them as people. So if you can imagine building a leadership philosophy based on the idea that everyone who works for you is either a child or a woman you don't ever have to consider the wellness of, or a human you don't consider human.
Wow.
This is the philosophy on which our workplace culture is actually still built today. 2012 isn't that far away because there are things we are doing that we were doing back in the 1800s when we started this process. And so absolutely, the structure on its face is not trauma informed. To begin with, it's not trauma informed because the leaders, the people who were in charge of this, were not in any way considering the wellness of their employees. They had no interest in that at all. Those were expendable members of a team who were intended to produce something, make something, or make something move. Right? This is really what they were doing. So that abusive structure comes from our own history. And I make no exception or apology for abusers. So that's not what I'm about to say. However, if you don't know any better, you don't know any better. And this is a multi-generational problem. Right? This is multi-generational, that patriarchy is very real. Misogyny is very real. We have lots of men in leadership, and men in leadership who have been taught and enculturated by both their workplaces and their home lives that you have structure and control. And if people don't respond to that structure and control, then they should therefore be penalized. And the way in which people execute that penalty varies in a lot of ways, doesn't it? Up to and including abusive behaviors.
Yeah.
So absolutely, those behaviors are going to both generate from the workplace and generate from the home. And it's absolutely impossible. Although, again, it used to be a very common and is still in some places a very common theory that, we leave our personal life at home and we have our business life, and those two things, never the two shall meet. That is not possible because we exist in both of those places, but we've really been taught that. I was an educator and a nonprofit leader, and now I'm a consultant. So I've actually had very little experience in like a corporate or office work space, some, but not a lot. But I'm still a fan of the show The Office.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
A lot of people are familiar with The Office, and talk about a non-trauma informed work environment. So many things wrong and yet oh so right in that environment. And one of the most interesting things is there's a little scene where Michael, in the US version of The Office, Michael is the manager. He meets the old manager, Ed Truck. They have a conversation, and Ed Truck looks at him and says, you have your employees be your employees and you have your friends be your friends. And he's very gruff with him about it. It doesn't work like that. We bring our personalities to both places. So yeah, if you are structured to the point of control and over the line towards abuse, and you become a leader, you're going to bring that into your leadership. And absolutely, if you are someone for whom that is a very negative experience, it's a difficult experience for everybody, you're going to have a re-traumatization, and either you're going to be not productive because you're living in fear of that boss, or you're going to leave. Yep. Because that's your options, right?
And I guess in the interest of running a profitable business, those are very costly outcomes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, part of leadership training and why why I spend time in that diversity, equity, and inclusion space, really listening and learning. If you're listening, you can't see me, but I'm a white woman, and therefore I come pre-built with a level of unconscious bias, and I come pre-built with a level of privilege that my fellow humans who do not share my skin color or English is their first language, etc., do not receive. I happen to be able-bodied, so also don't have that experience. We have to listen and learn because our workplaces are becoming more diverse, and we get very excited about that. But our leadership hasn't gotten very diverse, and our leadership hasn't adjusted to the idea that all of these folks that are coming in that bring in marvelous perspectives and experiences and powerfully transforming spaces can, in fact, really amplify the ability of our organizations to do amazing things if we listen and if we learn to lead differently. But if we try to lead in that controlled, this is the way we do things, no flexibility, no humanity, all of those ways, we're going to lose those voices very, very quickly. They are not going to stay in the workforce. They don't need to stay in the workforce for that. And frankly, workplaces shouldn't look like that. We know too much now about the idea that we are able to get so much more out of our employees.
Yeah.
And if you're a leader, the most expensive thing you'll ever do is hire.
I can appreciate that comment.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. I mean, at the end of the day, if you can't buy in to any of the other trauma-informed ideas because they are in fact good ideas for treating humans well, boy, I hope that is a thing you want to do. But if at the end of the day you can't buy into that, buying into the notion that productivity and retention are directly tied to your ability to recognize the humanity in your organization and understand its power, and also understand your obligations to honor it. At the end of the day, your bottom line is significantly better if you can do that. And so if you have no other reason to buy into the trauma-informed practice, the fact that that this is the way, the result of trauma-informed organizations should be motivation enough. And if you've had to try to hire, boy, I did that for a long time, and it's not easy, and it's expensive and time consuming, and hard on your other employees, by the way. If you're constantly understaffed and they're having to train somebody new and then train somebody new and then train somebody new, this is hard on your good people as well that have stayed around, and you'll wear them out, and then you'll have a real problem.
Absolutely. The other thing that came to mind too, as you were speaking, Nichole, was if we think about the trends that we see in the cycle of abuse as well, and perhaps look at the hypothetical scenario of the little boy who sees domestic violence playing out in the home, and statistically being so much more likely to display those kinds of behaviours as an adult. We see the same thing happening in the workplace. Workers who are subject to abusive supervision techniques tend to adopt the same methodologies and approach. It's a cycle.
Correct. It is. It's a cycle, and it is a cycle that contributes to that lack of productivity, contributes to retention issues. It also contributes things. So domestic violence, for example, being a thing that is not that I know a lot about and have spent time looking at workplaces. People are going to get affected by this. The cost in the US of missed workdays, the number of missed workdays annually as a result of domestic violence, is 8 million, folks. 8 million workdays total lost annually.
Wow.
Related to domestic violence. If you have an abusive boss, if that abuse, setting aside the domestic or intimate partner piece of that, If you have an abusive boss, it's estimated that that number doubles.
That is staggering.
Uh-huh. Also in a very um transitory workplace anyway, right? I'm a Gen Xer, so I come from parents who worked in jobs in the same job for 35 years, 45 years, right? This is the thing. I didn't do that, but I worked in jobs for, decade or longer. Now that has shrunk just naturally. So we are seeing employees that stay, you get an employee that stays 5 years. That's getting to be a long tenure these days. The average employee, though, is staying between 18 and 28 months in a job, especially in an entry-level job. So when we're talking about those blue-collar jobs, 18 to 28 months, that number will be reduced by a third if the leader is poor.
Wow.
Yeah. So imagine it takes you 2 to 3 months to get somebody onboarded minimum, and they're going to stay 5 or
Yeah.
6.
That's crippling, isn't it? Especially for small business. And we work a lot with small businesses as well. So, the cost in some cases with a lot of our clientele who might be, say, subcontracting to some of our bigger clients is that if they have a person who's taking absentee days or taking sick days for whatever reason, or if they leave, it can actually stop their operation entirely. It can take them
Absolutely.
off the road. And then, like you said, I like to think that a lot of people really see the value and buy into this because they want to make a difference. They want to provide an excellent workplace for their teams, and they want to enjoy time at work. I prefer to enjoy my time at work. I spend a lot of time here,
Yeah.
but the value proposition is there for people who operate at that level. If people who don't operate at that level, the value proposition is the bottom line, as you said.
That's right. Well, and you make a really interesting and important point about how we spend our times. In modern times, how we spend our time. There was a social scientist, Oldenthorpe, I'm going to get his name wrong, who studied what he called places. And so he named the third space, the second space, and the first space. And I come out of nonprofits and informal education. So we were part of this third space. These are the community spaces we go and gather, and these are the spaces we spend time, kind of our social time together. They're very impactful spaces. And the first space is the home, right? This is allegedly, this is your primary space. But the space you spend the most time in is the second space. And that's your workspace. That's where you're spending most of your time. So if that environment is unhealthy, if it is toxic, if it has poor leadership, or if you are the person that is inflicting all of that, it is inevitable that that is going to manifest into leaking into your first and your third spaces as well. And also is going to make the majority of your time miserable, which is so bad for us on so many levels, right? Like, just if you're spending all of your time in this space, and small business owners in particular, right? They're spending all of their time, right? The alleged full-time work week of 40 hours is a myth. Most of them have worked 40 hours by Tuesday, and so I how much time you spend in an environment, why would you not craft that environment so consciously to be healthy and well and happy and collaborative? You're going to be there more than you're going to be anywhere else.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we bring it back to the context of the frontline leader, and let's say that we have listeners thinking, okay, I remember Jason and Nichole talking about the fact that some of the challenging situations and behaviors that I have to respond to regularly could be trauma responses, and I need to be more trauma informed. And how can I respond to these situations differently than the way I am at the moment? And, and we're certainly not suggesting that we approach an individual and say, hey, it looks like you're having a trauma response. Are you? right? So
Right.
where would be a really good place to start for the person who wants to become more aware?
Right. That's a great question because, right, the fact of the matter is a couple of things are at play in those difficult moments, especially if you're a frontline leader, right? Because if you're a frontline leader, you really have three players involved in these interactions. You have your employee, you have yourself, and then you have the third party, your client. And anyone and all three of you could be having something that is a full-blown trauma response or is just a bad day, right? Those things exist too, that are going to cause a series of dominoes to fall. So that moment is not the time, by the way, to address this issue. These are the things we do outside of that service space so that we can improve our responses inside of them. So you really are looking at what is the training that is happening outside? What is the culture of work that you have built? And how have you created spaces for people to release those normal stress and stressors that happen at work so that they don't develop into traumas, both for you as the leader and for your employees? The first thing for frontline leaders, though, is that they've got to remember that that employee is also a human, is also possibly having a hard time. The second thing is that to remember that you as the leader are human and may possibly be having a hard time. And the same thing is true for that client. So there are some things I really love to put into place. One is borrowed from a organizational cultural leader here in the United States named Sam Parker, who likes this, has a program called Inspire Your People. And when I was doing some leadership work with some toxic, very toxic workplaces, one of the really quick and easy things that I have always been able to implement is something called on-stage and backstage behavior. And it's such a wonderful trauma response because it falls into this category we call peer support. I have you and you have me, and we recognize that if something goes wrong, it doesn't need to be about us personally. And we can handle that in the moment. And also we can make space to express that later. And so on-stage behavior would say, I'm having a really hard time with this very difficult client who's come in and wants to be served in a certain way. And that exchange is very tense. And I'm having a hard time holding it together. I'll do better as your employee in holding it together and communicating if I know that after we have that very difficult exchange, which would be considered on stage, I'm going to use the language I've been taught. I'm going to use the skills and the service responses I've been taught. When that goes away, I can look at you as my leader and say, I need a backstage moment. And now I can literally go somewhere where I'm not seen. And either you can accompany me or I can have another peer or employee with me to say, I need a backstage moment, which means I've set up the idea that the rest of what I'm going to say to you now doesn't have anything to do with you. You know it doesn't have anything to do with you. So we still are going to be friends. Even as I unload how difficult that whole exchange was for me and how frustrated I was and how upsetting and unsettling it is when they come in and they were supposed to have this and they didn't, and I tried. I'm able to start to express and process that. You get to know me better. I get to feel better. It's very brief. I can go back to being on stage again. Think about what would happen inside your business if you just allowed for that 90-second, 2 minutes, 3 minutes of regroup for your employees, instead of sending them outside. We have different laws because we're not in the same country, but here in the US, you work a 4-hour shift, you can get a 15-minute break. And how many high stress customer service folks I see on the side of buildings smoking cigarettes angrily for that 15 minutes because they've been on stage and they're feeling so much. They don't really have a way to release it. So they've turned to an unhealthy addictive behavior to try to manage it, as opposed to being able to say to you, oh, this was so maddening and this was so frustrating. And then you get little other glimpses like, and she looked like my mother, right? You see these other things. You are able to hear that, honor it, help that be released, get to know what's difficult for your employee, offer them other support, how well you did with that exchange, or you could have called me in sooner, or perhaps, we could try this next time. I noticed how frustrating that was for you. You get a coaching moment, and then you send them back to work. So much more healthy, aware, the employee feels heard. You as a leader get to participate in that. You're getting better client services, because if I've had 4 of those interactions before lunchtime and you're the 5th or 6th client that comes in, I could be not so nice to you, even if you're a nice guy, because I've already had it. I've already been spent by these other folks. That's a trauma-informed practice. And if you align it with groups who've been doing this for a while, like therapist groups, right? Therapists are wonderful people, but talk about a high-stress job.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Hour after hour after hour after hour of listening to that kind of unloading, they have to be able to release that. And those organizations that have really healthy workplaces and really healthy therapy organizations, they know that therapists have therapists so that they can release all of that stress that they're carrying. If you applied that to a customer service situation, to a working on a line situation where you're working with lots of people all at once, that's a really powerful transformation. And it doesn't sacrifice any time for you, really. It just sets your people back up on their feet really quickly.
I love that concept of on-stage moments and off-stage moments, because in our leadership programs, we talk a lot with our cohort on the amygdala hijack in conflict situations, and some techniques we can use to help the other person regulate their emotions or keep them in a regulated state, and to regulate our own emotions. And we talk about some simple techniques and the breathing and using conscious thinking to understand your trigger points and and how to recognize physical symptoms in the body in those moments. And and sometimes we talk about the fact that sometimes you have to step away for a moment, and this is your off-stage moment.
Yes.
Yeah, I love that way of explaining it.
This is getting back to that, and the amygdala hijack is such a great thing to know about and understand, because that is, that inflamed brain part. When that amygdala takes over, that's, again, it's a life-saving thing. We needed that thing, but not only has it taken over and released all those physical symptoms, what you need to know about the rest of the things that is happening inside of your brain is that prefrontal cortex, which is your decision-making, problem-solving, language-generating part of your brain, it has gone to sleep. It is offline at that moment. So also, leaders, if you're looking at an employee and you can see that has happened to them, you see the body language change, you hear the tone of voice change, you see that, you've got to know there is an intervention that had better happen there, because that person doesn't matter how fabulous that employee is, they cannot engage that prefrontal cortex right now. They can't do it. It's out of our control. At that point, it becomes a physiological response. It's a parasympathetic system has taken over for you. And that's the ball game until you calm that down. That is just the ball game until you calm it down. And so very brilliant, wonderful employees will sometimes completely lose it. And that is a result of that system overload. What you want is that fabulous employee being fabulous more times than not. So you have to be able to build environment, structures, community, etc., a workplace, a culture that prevents that inflammation from happening, that hijack from happening constantly. Because if you put somebody into that state all of the time, you're going to diminish that problem-solving opportunity. You're going to diminish that response. And it really ceases to matter how wonderful either you are as a leader, if this is happening to you as a leader, or how wonderful that employee is. They can't deliver what they need to deliver.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes when you're trying to resolve a problem or you've got something to deal with, sometimes when you can recognize that in the other person, you really need to put your agenda to the side, don't you? And deal with the person's emotional needs in the moment, because that's the most pressing issue. Because as you say, nothing productive is going to happen while the other person is in a dysregulated state.
That's right. And so I refer to that as the gap. That's actually the resilience gap. One of the phrases we get wrong a lot in trauma-informed practices is resilience, because we really have this view of resilience as like tough, right? You dust yourself off. When you're resilient, you take that hit and you just go back again. You take another hit and you go back again because you're resilient. That's actually not resilience at all. There are 7 types of resilience that have been researched, but the 2 that I like to talk to people about are adaptability and flexibility, in part because they're the most compassionate versions of resilient, but also they have the best health outcomes, the best retention outcomes, the best productivity outcomes. And what you're trying to do with resilience actually is not muscle through it. What you're actually trying to do in resilience is calm that amygdala hijack. The resilience act that we talk about, right, of a big natural disaster, right, in a community, and there are terrible things that happen. And then the newscaster comes on and says, this is the 3rd one of these in 25 years, because we're hearing more things like that all of the time these days. But it's such a resilient community. They always come back. And then they'll pan to, people cleaning up and doing all of this hard work. And look, the resilient part isn't that part. It's the part they didn't catch. It's the gap part. It's where they went and sat together and cried and mourned. It's where they talked together and sang together and created art together and recouped what was broken for themselves for a moment. That gap between this terrible thing happened and I responded, that's the resilience gap. That's actually what you want to do. So as a leader, you've got to make a space for that resilience gap to get built. And I believe if you're a really clever leader, what you need to say is, we're actually going to practice skills and set up spaces inside our workplaces to have resilience activities. And we're going to do it when we're not in trauma. Because again, we know if we're in trauma, we have amygdala hijack. We're not thinking about what's happening. The least helpful, most kind phrase I ever hear, and I hear leaders use it all the time, is, well, what do you need right now? Well, look, if my brain is inflamed and my amygdala is going saber-tooth tiger, the last thing I can tell you is what it is I need right now. But if I do that in a non-trauma state, and I know that going for a quick walk helps me, or if there was a section in the break room that has, keeps my favorite snacks, or whatever it is there are all kinds of little things that I can do for myself to help calm myself down. If I've been able to unpack those in a non-trauma setting, and my leader has been able to respond to those in some way, right? It's really helpful for us to have music at lunch. Okay. That's an easy thing to do, right? If you're able to get to that space, you do that when the trauma hasn't occurred, knowing that this is going to happen because it's part of our human experience. We're going to have a trigger. We're going to get unbalanced. We're going to get dysregulated. The goal isn't, we want to prevent as much dysregulation as we can. So we don't want to set up traumatic leadership. We don't want to set up abusive situations. But we also need to recognize there are some things we can't do anything about. and it's going to happen. So we want to build in responses that are attainable for us, attainable for our employees, accessible. They do not need to be complex. Again, you need no therapist sitting back in your break room waiting to have somebody unpack to them. You don't need to do that. You need to have actual healthy responses for people to engage in bit by bit all the time. I had a wonderful, well-intentioned, trauma-informed leader get a hold of me and say, we tried, we gave this credit, they gave $300 to every employee, and they wanted them to use them for this wellness. They were worried about their health and well-being, so they wanted them to use this for this like wellness program. And it was like yoga classes and a gym membership. You could choose all these different things. She was like, 80% of my employees didn't do it. It's like, really? And of course, she says, do they not value this? Do they not want it? Like, she's offended all of a sudden. I said, well, did you ask the employees what they wanted? That $300. These are service to service employees. They don't earn a lot of money. And at the end of the day, when I got to them and got to facilitate, we learned very quickly, no, they didn't want $300 to extend their day to go to yoga class or do a gym class. That was going to cost them more money in childcare. They wanted grocery cards and gas cards and things like getting their tires fixed on their car. They wanted the flexibility of what would actually benefit them, and they knew what it was. So the moral of that story, leaders, is don't prescribe what it is that your folks need. Ask them to tell you. Build a culture of trust where they can come and tell you what it is that they need, and then cultivate a response accordingly. And you'll have high value, you'll have happy employees, and you'll be in a trauma-informed workspace. You'll be amazed at the results.
Fantastic. And what I love about all the suggestions and knowledge bombs that you've dropped, to me, I can't think of any that seem out of reach for anybody. They don't take a lot of resources or cost, just a little bit of effort and awareness and a bit of knowledge, right?
That's exactly right. I think we overinflate because, in large part, right, we saw major tech companies do what I used to call accidental wellness, right? Where suddenly we saw this upended, like we have dogs and a beer garden on Friday, and there's foosball tables in ours because we want people to unload. It wasn't super well intended because a lot of the leadership wasn't informed, and so you had a lot of abusive leadership happening outside, and it was kind of the response was like, we're going to beat on you in these cubicles, but then we're going to let you release it by playing some foosball. But it started to look like you needed to have foosball tables and a beer garden and chefs on site and ergonomic everything to have wellness inside your company. And no, you don't. In fact, those things don't infer wellness at all if they're not done properly. So instead, it's these very small tweaks, the way you're talking about and to your people, the way you're bringing them in together, the way you're encouraging them to work together and encourage each other, and the little adjustments that you are making to their workplace that let them know you've heard them and that you're responding to them. Sometimes somebody is going to tell you something that is out of reach. It's going to be out of reach for your time, for your budget, whatever, right? I live in the southern part of the United States, as I've mentioned, and during the summer months, it's very common for a lot of organizations to not have work on Fridays. But when I was a nonprofit leader, I worked in a setting that we were very busy 6 days a week. We were open 6 days a week. And off on Fridays was not an option for us. And so every time I did a culture check, somebody would note that the organization down the road, their people were off on Fridays during the summer months. And for a while, I was like, I don't want to talk about this. I just don't want to talk about this. until I finally had to gather everybody together and say, no, we have to talk about this. I hear you. What you're saying is you wish that this thing that happens, this free time on a weekday in the summer, which feels very, right, it feels very empowered and light and vacation-like. You wish we could do this. But our organization doesn't function like this. What else can we do? And engaged them in the conversations of what, what things could we do that were fun? What things could we do that did adjust work schedules somewhat? Did we have other options we hadn't considered before? And we did it as a team. When you're the leader, you have to make the best decision you can for your organization. And sometimes that means making the best decision for your people in your organization, not just your bottom line. And if you do that, that bottom line follows. And so you do have to engage in some difficult conversations, but you'll find over time, people will start to come to you with like, I know this would be great. It would be great if we had a chef, right? Inside. Wouldn't it be great if you got to go home with a pre-cooked dinner at the end of your shift? That would be wonderful. That's not feasible here. But I was thinking, and somebody's got another, I wonder if we ever did a co-op meal exchange on Sundays, if that would help people, right? People start to solve their own challenges. They start to want to build up their workplaces. And that's amazingly powerful and low cost and effective for you.
Who'd have thought? Just a little bit of open communication.
That's right. I mean, it turns out if we talk to our people, that they're brilliant and they will share with us if only we'll listen.
Absolutely. Nichole, thank you so much for what you've shared today. You've imparted so much wisdom, and I'm so thrilled that we did this. Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
I've personally have gotten a lot from this conversation, and I hope that our listeners do too. I'm sure they will. But honestly, sincerely, thank you so much.
It's been my pleasure, and I hope we get to continue the conversation. And for individuals who are listening, if you're curious where to find me, I am Myles to Go Speaking and Consulting, and I'm Myles with a Y, not with an I. So it's MYLES, Myles to Go Speaking and Consulting. And you can always follow me on a variety of social media channels, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, or you can reach out directly via my website and ask a question or get connected. I would love to continue the conversation. It has been great to be here, Jason. So thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. Thank you so much again. And I think, we'll have another conversation another time about maybe some other stuff we can do together between yourself and myself and my team as well. So I think there's some good stuff to do there. So thank you so much again, everybody. I hope you've gotten something from this. Please check out Nichole's website, and you can find Nichole's TED Talk on YouTube. You can find the Lead 2022 talk I really enjoyed on YouTube as well. So please go out and check out Nichole and give a follow. Thank you so much for tuning in. Please don't forget to give the 5-star rating. That helps us very, very much to reach more people. So thanks so much, everybody. Stay well, and we'll see you next time.